Have you ever wondered what it feels like to carry a secret so heavy that it shapes your life for years? To hold on to a story so painful, yet so powerful, that it changes everything you thought you knew about love, loss, and survival. This is a story of courage, heartbreak, and the quiet strength that often goes unnoticed. A story that might remind you of something deep within your own life. Stay with me, because this is a journey you won't forget. How one woman found courage after years of suffering in silence. The beginning of a struggle. Growing up in a small town in rural America, I learned at a young age that love, or at least what I had witnessed, wasn't always as simple as the fairy tales we hear about. My name is Sarah, and this is the story of my childhood, one that shaped the woman I became, for better or for worse. And like many stories, it begins with my parents. My father, Richard, was a good man. A quiet man who worked with his hands, fixing cars and helping out anyone who needed it. He was the kind of man you could rely on, a man who would never let you down. He wasn't perfect, but to me, he was the epitome of goodness. His hands were rough, his body tired from long hours spent under the hood of cars in the dusty garage he owned in our little town. But his heart was what always shone brightest. It was pure, full of love, ready to give whatever he had to anyone who needed it. He was a man of few words, but his actions spoke louder than anything. And then there was my mother, Helen. To say she was beautiful was an understatement. Her beauty was the kind that made heads turn when she entered a room, the kind that made people stop and stare. Tall, slender, with flowing dark hair that shimmered in the sunlight and eyes so green they seemed to pierce through you, Helen had an air about her that left people breathless. But beauty, as I would come to learn, is often a double-edged sword. While my father was quietly admired for his strength, my mother's beauty was both a gift and a curse. They met when my father was still young, just starting out, and my mother came from a far-off town where no one knew much about her past. She had a certain mysteriousness about her, a sense of being untouchable, like she had secrets no one else could ever understand. People would whisper in the small town, talking about the things she'd left behind in her old life, rumors about a past she rarely spoke of. But my father didn't care about the rumors. All he saw were those emerald eyes, that hair, that smile. He was in love, deeply and utterly. When they married, it was clear to everyone who knew them that my father was head over heels for her. And at first, I suppose my mother was in love too. But as time went on, it became evident that their marriage was one-sided. And it wasn't because my father wasn't trying. No, it was because my mother, with all her beauty, had a darker side. A side that demanded constant attention, control, and a love that was unhealthy. I was born just 3 months after they tied the knot, and I grew up watching my father love my mother with a kind of devotion that wasn't healthy, yet he couldn't see it. He was blinded by his love for her. Every day he bent over backward to make her happy, to give her everything she wanted. He worked himself to the bone, yet nothing he did seemed to be enough. I watched as he tried, day in and day out, to be the perfect husband to a woman who could never be satisfied. My mother didn't seem to care about the sacrifices my father made for her. She would demand expensive things, dresses, jewelry, anything that caught her eye, and my father would go to great lengths to get them for her. I remember one time, I was only about 7 years old, and I watched as my father counted the money he had saved up for months to buy my mother a dress she'd been eyeing in a store in town. It was more than he could afford, but he didn't care. He borrowed money from his boss just to make her happy. When he handed her the dress, I saw the disappointment on his face when she barely even acknowledged it. She looked at the dress, shrugged, and said, "It's not what I expected." That was all. My father just stood there, trying to hide his hurt behind a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He thought that by giving her everything, he could prove his love. But all he was doing was feeding a bottomless pit that would never be satisfied. As I grew older, I began to understand what was happening around me. I saw how my father's devotion to my mother drained him, how his body became weaker and his spirit slowly faded. It was as if every day that passed, a little more of him disappeared. And all the while, my mother only seemed to grow more demanding. I watched as she belittled him, made him feel small, and in return, he gave more. It was a cycle I didn't understand, but it was my reality. The worst part, though, was that my father believed it. He honestly believed that he didn't deserve anything better, that he was lucky to have someone like my mother in his life. He thought that if he just kept giving, she would eventually love him the way he loved her. But that's not how love works. That's not real love. And it took me years to understand that. I remember asking him once when I was about 10, why he put up with it. Why did he let my mother treat him that way? His response haunts me to this day. When someone you love is hurting, you do whatever it takes to make them happy, even if it costs you everything. It sounded like a noble sentiment, but in reality, it was the exact opposite. He was letting her drain him, both physically and emotionally, and I couldn't do anything to stop it. So, I sat there, day after day, feeling a mixture of anger and sadness as I watched my father shrink under the weight of his devotion. He didn't see it, not even when it was too late. He couldn't. And I was just a child. Too young to help, too young to understand what was happening. But I knew one thing for sure. The love between my parents wasn't normal. It wasn't healthy, and it was going to destroy us all. The mystery of her mother's past. As I grew older, I began to notice more than just the way my father shrank under my mother's cruelty. I started to realize there were other things at play, things I couldn't fully understand as a child, but they gnawed at me like whispers in the wind, pulling at the corners of my consciousness. It was as though my mother wasn't entirely who she seemed to be. There was always something off about her, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. My mother, Helen, was a beauty, a woman whose charm and allure were undeniable, but her beauty wasn't the whole story. It was the mystery behind her eyes, the way she could never fully connect with anyone, including me, that left a lingering sense of discomfort. I grew up hearing snippets of conversations among the neighbors, and the hushed voices always spoke of her past, of her life before she came to live in our small town. There were rumors, whispers that I wasn't supposed to hear, but did anyway. "She came from Tennessee, you know," one of the neighbors would say, their voice lowered to a near whisper. "Some say she ran away from home. Others say she had a husband before your father. Never quite figured it out. But you know, she's got that mysterious look. Can't quite trust it." At first, I dismissed the rumors as gossip, as idle chatter meant to entertain. But as I got older, I couldn't ignore the fact that they were never really far from the surface. Everyone seemed to know something about my mother's past that I didn't, and I couldn't help but wonder what it was. It wasn't until I was about 12 that I began to pay closer attention. My mother was never one to speak much about her past. She rarely spoke about anything at all, except when she was complaining. But I began noticing small things, strange things, that didn't add up. She never spoke of her family. She never mentioned old friends or anything about her life before she met my father. It was as though her past had been erased, as though she had stepped off a plane in Millfield, Kentucky, with no history, no background. One day, While I was in the attic looking for some old books, I stumbled across a trunk in the corner, hidden under a dusty blanket. It was strange because I had never seen it before, despite having lived in the house for so many years. I lifted the lid cautiously, half expecting it to creak like an old ghost, but it didn't. Inside were a few old letters, a stack of photographs, and a faded, brown leather suitcase. Most of the contents were mundane. Old clothes, some trinkets, and a few things that didn't seem to belong to anyone in our family. But it was the letters that caught my attention. The handwriting on the letters was elegant, flowing, almost like a love letter. But what struck me was the name written at the top of one of the letters, Charlie. I didn't know a Charlie. I didn't know anyone who could have written her such intimate letters. Yet here they were, all neatly folded, preserved, tucked away in this trunk, like a secret. I didn't know what to do with the letters at first. My curiosity battled with my sense of propriety. I wasn't supposed to snoop, and my mother would never forgive me if she found out. But my father was at work, and I had the house to myself. Slowly, I picked up the first letter, unfolded it, and read the words that made my heart skip a beat. "Dearest Helen," the letter began, "I can't stop thinking about you, my love. Every moment away from you is an eternity, and though I try to convince myself that I can move on, I find it impossible. Our bond is too deep, too real. I can't give you up, not after all we've shared. I promise I'll find a way. You'll be with me again." My breath caught in my throat. I felt like I had just uncovered something forbidden, something that was never meant for my eyes. The letter went on to speak of a love so intense, so passionate, it seemed to consume everything in its path. It was clear that this Charlie had once been a significant part of my mother's life. Someone she had loved deeply, perhaps more than she had ever loved my father. The realization hit me hard. The woman who had been my mother, the one who was supposed to guide me, protect me, and care for me, had a past filled with love, secrets, and choices I didn't understand. She wasn't just the cold, distant woman I had grown up with. She had once been young, full of passion, maybe even reckless. And as the letter ended with a final line, "We'll find a way to be together, no matter what," I wondered what had happened to that love, that passion. How had it turned into the cruel, manipulative behavior I had witnessed my whole life? I didn't tell anyone about the letters. I knew better. It was a secret, one that would only make my already broken family even more complicated. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that there was so much more to my mother than I had ever been allowed to see. Maybe my father didn't know the whole truth either. Maybe he had married her not just because of her beauty, but because he didn't know the depths of her past. The way she had been willing to leave everything behind, to start over in a small town like Millfield. I started to see my parents differently. My father, with his constant sacrifice and devotion, had given everything for a woman who had left behind something, or someone, of immense importance. Was it guilt that made her treat him this way? Was it the regret of having lost a love that had burned so brightly? I couldn't make sense of it all. But the more I learned, the more I understood that my family wasn't what I thought it was. It wasn't just a simple story of a hardworking man and his beautiful wife. No, there were layers upon layers, and each layer revealed more darkness, more hurt, more deception. I could feel the weight of it all pressing down on me, and it was clear that the family I had grown up with was never going to be the same. And then there was the strangest part. I could never shake the feeling that my mother was still hiding something even deeper. It was like she was always a step ahead of everyone around her, carefully maintaining control, carefully keeping her secrets locked away, not just from my father, but from me too. There were days when I would catch her staring off into the distance, as if lost in a memory I would never be able to reach. My mother's past was a mystery I couldn't solve, and yet it became the key to understanding why my family had become the way it was. The more I uncovered, the more I began to see how deeply broken my mother was, and how her brokenness had seeped into every corner of our lives. The father's devotion. As the days turned into years, I found myself observing my father more closely. He was a man of few words, but his actions spoke volumes. I remember the way he moved through the house, often with his shoulders hunched, his back a little too bent from years of physical labor. It wasn't just the weight of work that seemed to have worn him down. It was the weight of his love. His unwavering, unrelenting devotion to a woman who barely seemed to notice the sacrifices he made for her. My father was the kind of man who would give you the shirt off his back, and I had witnessed it countless times. He worked long hours at the auto repair shop, sometimes from dawn until dusk, always striving to make ends meet. He wasn't a rich man, not by any means, but he never seemed to mind. He found joy in the simple things, fixing a broken car, helping out a neighbor, or spending an evening sitting on the porch with a cold beer in his hand, staring up at the stars. But the most important thing in my father's life was my mother, Helen. And it was for her that he gave everything. I remember the first time I saw the depth of his devotion. I was about 10 years old, and it was the middle of summer. My mother had seen a new car model in a magazine, one she couldn't afford, and suddenly it became her obsession. Every day she would talk about it, dream about it, and complain about how out of reach it was. My father, who had never been one to indulge in luxury, began to save every penny he could. One day, when the money in his coffee can reached the amount he thought might be enough, he went to the bank and took out a loan to cover the rest. He didn't ask my mother if it was okay, or if it was a wise decision. He just did it. He came home that afternoon with a brand new car parked in the driveway, shining under the summer sun, its chrome wheels glinting. I remember my mother's face when she saw it. She was ecstatic, her eyes wide with disbelief, and she hugged him tightly. "You did it, Richard!" she exclaimed, her voice full of excitement. But when she saw the price tag, her enthusiasm quickly faded. She muttered something about how it wasn't exactly what she had in mind and turned away. My father stood there, frozen, smiling awkwardly, as if he were waiting for her approval. But that approval never came. And that was the first moment I understood how deeply my father had been reduced. By love, yes, but also by the fear of rejection. His need to please my mother had become so consuming that it overshadowed everything else. He had worked himself to the bone for months, put his own financial stability at risk, and yet the car, which was meant to be a symbol of his love for her, wasn't enough. She never even acknowledged the effort. It didn't matter that he had sacrificed his own comfort or that he had gone into debt for something that she had wanted. In her eyes, it was just another thing that he hadn't done right. But my father didn't see it that way. No matter how many times my mother dismissed his gestures, how many times she belittled him or took him for granted, he kept giving. I began to watch him, not with the eyes of a daughter who loved her father, but with the eyes of a person who was trying to understand the complex web that had entangled him. I saw a man who was desperate, not for love, but for validation. He didn't need her affection as much as he needed her approval, and the more he tried to earn it, the more it seemed to slip through his fingers. It was heartbreaking to watch. My father, the man who had taught me right from wrong, the man who had once seemed unbreakable, was being torn apart by his own love. As the years passed, my father's devotion to my mother only grew more intense. It became almost pathological, like an addiction he couldn't quit. I saw the way he would apologize for things he hadn't done, how he would grovel, how he would accept blame for situations he had no control over. It was as though he was trying to prove something to her, to prove that he was worthy of her love, worthy of her attention. But no matter what he did, nothing was ever enough. I began to see the signs of wear and tear in him, physically, emotionally, and mentally. He had lost weight. He looked tired all the time. His face was etched with lines that hadn't been there before, and his once strong shoulders had begun to slouch. It was as if all of the love and effort he poured into my mother were slowly draining him, leaving behind an empty shell of the man he had once been. And yet, he couldn't stop. There were days when I could hear him crying at night, his muffled sobs coming from the bedroom, and I would lie in bed, unable to sleep, wondering how much longer he could keep this up. How much longer could a man live like this, constantly chasing something that was always just out of reach? One day, when I was about 15, I overheard a conversation between my parents. My mother was once again complaining about something, and my father, in his usual meek way, was trying to fix it. I could hear the desperation in his voice as he said, "Helen, I'll do whatever it takes to make you happy. You know that, right? I'll do anything." I don't think she heard the desperation. I don't think she understood how much he was hurting. All she heard was a man who was willing to bend over backward for her. And she continued to take it. I wanted to scream, to tell him to stop, to make him see what was happening. But I didn't. I just sat there, listening to my father's voice break, and I felt the weight of a broken family pressing down on me. My father's devotion to my mother was a thing of tragedy. He loved her in a way that was obsessive, unhealthy, and ultimately destructive. But it wasn't until years later that I truly understood the depth of his devotion, the way it had consumed him, until there was nothing left of the man I had once admired. He had given everything for her: his time, his energy, his love. And in the end, it had all been for nothing. What I didn't understand then was that love should never require someone to lose themselves. True love should build, not destroy. But at that time, I didn't know that. All I knew was that I watched my father crumble before my eyes, and I couldn't do anything to stop it. Signs of unhealthy love. By the time I was 16, I had seen enough to know that something was terribly wrong. My father's love for my mother had become a shadow of itself, warped into something almost unrecognizable. And yet, he continued to pour everything he had into her, as though he believed that if he just loved her harder, just gave more of himself, she would finally love him back in the way he wanted. But the more he gave, the more she took, and the emptier he became. I couldn't stand to watch it anymore, but I didn't know how to help him. No one did. He had become a prisoner of his own affection, trapped in a cycle of emotional abuse so subtle that even he couldn't see it. And my mother, Helen, was the master of this manipulation, the queen of emotional control, and she wielded her power with precision. It wasn't just about love anymore. It was about control, about making him believe he was worthless without her, that he couldn't function without her validation. I remember a particular evening when I began to see just how deep the rot ran. It had been a long day, and my father came home later than usual, exhausted from another long shift at the garage. He walked in, his shoulders slumped, and his face pale from the long hours in the heat. As usual, my mother was sitting on the porch, brushing her hair, staring off into the distance, as though she were waiting for something or someone. "How was work, Richard?" she asked, her voice detached, as if she couldn't care less about the answer. But my father, eager to please, stood there for a moment, collecting his thoughts before answering. "It was fine, Helen. Long day, but good," he replied, his voice tinged with weariness, yet still hopeful that his answer would make her smile, would elicit some kind of positive response from her. She didn't smile, though. Instead, she gave a short, dismissive sigh and tossed her hair back over her shoulder. "You know," she said, "I was hoping you'd be home earlier. I wanted to go to the store today, but now it's too late. I can't go on my own, you know. It's not safe." My father's eyes immediately softened, and he stepped forward, his face full of concern. "I'm sorry, Helen. I didn't mean to be late. If you need to go, I'll take you right now." It wasn't about the store. It never was. She didn't really care about going. It was about him feeling guilty, about him feeling like he had failed her. Yet again. And my father, like always, fell right into her trap. He grabbed his keys and followed her out to the car without another word, even though it was already getting dark. He had learned long ago that his presence was required at her side at all times. His worth was determined by how much he could give, how much he could prove. As they left, I stayed behind, sitting in the silence of the house, the air thick with tension. I couldn't help but feel a pit in my stomach. I had seen this act play out countless times. My mother would never be satisfied. Nothing he did was ever enough. She would continue to demand more from him until there was nothing left to give. And my father, always trying to be the perfect husband, would keep giving it to her. He would keep sacrificing everything just to keep her from turning that cold shoulder. The next day, I found out just how far the manipulation went. My mother, seemingly carefree, asked me to do something that seemed simple at first. She asked me to go out and buy groceries for the house. It wasn't an unusual request. She often had me run errands or take care of the housework. But when I went to the kitchen to get the list, I noticed something strange. There, on the counter, was my father's paycheck, lying open. And on top of it, a note from my mother. "Take $100 out for the grocery store, but don't tell your father." "He doesn't need to know," it read. At first, I didn't understand. Why would she want to hide the money from him? Why would she be so secretive about something so trivial? But as I read the note again, the meaning became clear. She was keeping him in the dark. She was controlling everything, his money, his time, his love. And he didn't even realize it. I didn't want to confront her about it. I didn't want to add fuel to the fire, but the more I thought about it, the more I felt sick to my stomach. My father worked hard for that money, and yet she was treating it as though it were hers to spend at her whim. She had always done this, taken control in subtle ways, manipulating him into believing that he couldn't make decisions without her. It was a system she had perfected over the years, and it was working. I decided to keep quiet about the note, but that didn't stop me from feeling the weight of it. It wasn't just about money. It was about power. It was about making my father feel small, as if he couldn't even be trusted with the simplest things in their life. And that realization shattered something inside of me. I had always believed that my mother was just a difficult person, that maybe she was just unhappy. But now, I understood that this wasn't about unhappiness. This was about something much darker. This was about control, manipulation, and the slow erosion of my father's spirit. Over the next few weeks, I began to pay closer attention to their interactions. I watched as my father tried to make my mother happy, tried to do things for her that he thought would earn her love and approval. But nothing he did was ever enough. If he bought her a gift, she would find something wrong with it. If he made her dinner, she would complain that it wasn't the way she liked it. If he tried to show affection, she would recoil, as though his touch was a burden. But the most heartbreaking part was seeing how my father took all of it, day after day. He didn't fight back. He didn't question her. He just accepted it, because he believed that was what love was. That love meant sacrificing everything, even your own happiness, for the person you loved. And slowly I saw him deteriorate. He became thinner, more tired. His eyes lost their spark, and his laughter, once so full of life, became rare. I wanted to scream at him to stop, to stand up for himself, but I didn't. I couldn't. I was just a girl, powerless to change the dynamic between them. But I knew, deep down, that if something didn't change soon, it would be too late for all of us. It wasn't until much later that I understood how deep the damage went. The way my father had become a shell of himself wasn't just because of my mother's cruelty. It was because he had allowed himself to become lost in her version of love. The price of love. The summer of my 17th year was the turning point in my life. It was the season when I realized that love, the kind of love my father believed in, the kind of love he had given to my mother all his life, wasn't worth the price he had paid for it. And it wasn't just the sacrifices he had made for her that broke him. It was the fact that he had always thought he had to keep giving more, until he had nothing left. That was the moment I saw clearly. Love, at least the way my father understood it, could destroy you. It started with something small, or at least it seemed small at first. My mother had once again seen something she wanted, a new purse, one that was more expensive than anything we had ever bought in our family. I watched as she lingered over the magazine ads, the catalogs she had filled with circles around bags, shoes, and jewelry that we couldn't afford. I had seen this before. How she would ask my father for these things, knowing he couldn't afford them, knowing he would do anything to make her happy. But this time, it was different. This time, my father's expression when he walked into the house was one of resolve, not just exhaustion. He walked up to my mother, his face pale but determined, and I knew immediately that he was about to do something he shouldn't. "Helen," he said quietly, his voice strained, "I want to get you that purse. I know you've been looking at it for months, and I've been saving up some money. I'll do whatever it takes to get it for you." My mother, sitting on the porch as usual, barely looked up from the book she was reading. She didn't smile, she didn't thank him. She simply nodded and said, "It's about time you thought of me, Richard." I watched as he walked to the small drawer in the kitchen, the drawer where he kept the little savings he had accumulated over the years. He opened it and began counting the money. I had seen him do this many times, counting the change he had scraped together over weeks or months, trying to make it enough for something my mother wanted. But this time I saw the weight of it on his face. I saw the fear in his eyes. "Richard." My mother's voice broke through the silence, cool and detached. "It's not enough. It's never enough." His face flushed, and I could tell that the words stung. But instead of walking away or telling her he couldn't do it, he made a decision that would haunt me forever. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the last of his savings. He knew he didn't have enough, but he didn't care. "I'll borrow the rest," he said, his voice barely audible. "I'll ask my boss for a loan. He'll understand." It wasn't the first time my father had taken out loans for her. It wasn't the first time he had put himself in financial jeopardy to please her. But this time, I could see the cracks in his resolve. I could see the exhaustion, the desperation, the hopelessness in his eyes. He had sacrificed so much for her over the years, and yet, in her eyes, it was never enough. And this time, I knew, deep down, that he was paying a price he couldn't afford. Later that evening I sat at the kitchen table, waiting for my father to return. I had heard him leave to go to the bank, his footsteps heavy as he walked down the path. My mind was racing, thinking about the choices he had made. I couldn't help but feel angry. Not just at my mother, but at him. Why couldn't he see it? Why couldn't he understand that this wasn't love? It was addiction. It was a sickness that had been eating away at him for years. When he came back, I could see the strain on his face. He handed the purse to my mother, and she examined it with her usual cold detachment. She didn't smile. She didn't thank him. She simply said, "It's not exactly the one I wanted, but I suppose it will do." And that was it. My father stood there, waiting for her approval, waiting for her to say something, anything that would make him feel like his sacrifice had been worth it. But she didn't. She took the purse, walked to the bedroom, and left him standing in the living room, alone, once again. I couldn't watch anymore. I couldn't stand to see him so broken, so willing to destroy himself just to make her happy. But what hurt the most was that he didn't even realize it. He thought this was love. He thought that if he just kept giving, she would eventually see how much he loved her. But all he was doing was feeding her insatiable need for more, and it was slowly killing him. I waited until he was alone in the garage that night, repairing a car. I stood by the door, unsure if I should confront him. But I couldn't stay silent anymore. "Dad," I said softly, stepping into the dimly lit garage. He didn't look up at first, too focused on his work. But when he heard the tremble in my voice, he stopped, his wrench pausing in midair. "What is it, honey?" he asked, his voice strained. "You can't keep doing this, Dad. You can't keep sacrificing everything for her. It's not healthy. It's not love." For the first time, he looked at me, really looked at me, as if he were seeing me for the first time in years. His face was pale, his eyes tired, and yet, when he spoke, there was a deep sadness in his voice, one that cut straight through me. "I don't know what else to do, Sarah. I love her. I always have. And if I stop doing this, if I stop giving, then I'll lose her. I can't lose her. I can't live without her." I could feel the tears rising in my throat, but I swallowed them back. I couldn't let him see me break. Not now. "Dad," I said, my voice firm, "you've already lost yourself, and you're losing us too. You can't keep doing this. You need to stop." But he didn't hear me. He didn't understand. He turned back to his car, grabbed his wrench, and continued working as if nothing had been said. And I realized, in that moment, that no matter how much I loved him, no matter how hard I tried to help him see the truth, he would never change. He was too far gone in his belief that love meant sacrificing everything. I walked away from the garage, my heart heavy with the knowledge that I couldn't save him. I couldn't stop him from making the same mistakes over and over again. And it hurt. It hurt in a way I couldn't explain, knowing that the man I loved so much would never truly be happy, never truly be free. The price of love was too high, and my father had paid it over and over again. And in the end, it wasn't just my mother who had taken everything from him. It was his belief that love required suffering. And I was left wondering, if love requires suffering, then what's left for us when it's all gone? The manipulative nature of her mother. By the time I was 17, I had come to understand something that I hadn't been able to put into words when I was younger. My mother, Helen, wasn't just a woman with high expectations or a demanding personality. She was something far more dangerous. She was a master manipulator. And what made her manipulation even more dangerous was the way she did it with such precision, with such subtlety, that no one, including me, could see it for what it truly was until it was too late. Helen wasn't cruel in the way I would have imagined a villain to be. She didn't shout or scream. She didn't make loud demands or wield her power overtly. No, her cruelty was quiet, passive, and oh so effective. She had an uncanny ability to make people feel small, make them feel like they owed her something, as though everything she did, every act of kindness, every favor, was actually a transaction in which she expected something in return. And it was never enough. Looking back, I realize how she honed her skills of manipulation, and it's almost as though she had studied people, learned how to play on their weaknesses, how to use their desires and fears against them. My father was the first victim of this carefully crafted manipulation. He loved her with every fiber of his being, and she knew it. She knew that he would bend over backward to please her, that he would give her anything she wanted, anything at all. But the thing about manipulation is that it doesn't work unless you create a need, a void in the person you're trying to control. My mother, I now realize, created that void in my father's life. She made him believe that he couldn't function without her, that without her love, he was nothing. And over time, he began to believe it. He didn't just crave her affection, he needed it. He needed her approval more than he needed to breathe. And in that need, my mother found her power. I saw it in the way she would subtly chip away at his self-esteem, little by little, until he was a mere shadow of the man he used to be. She would speak to him in a way that made him doubt his worth, always hinting at how he could never truly be good enough for her. She was skilled at making him feel like he was lucky to have her, that she was doing him a favor by staying with him, even though she treated him like an afterthought. I remember the way she would dismiss his efforts, the way she would make him feel insignificant. It was never enough. Whatever he did, however much he gave, it was never enough to satisfy her. And yet, when she wanted something, whether it was a new dress, a piece of jewelry, or just her favorite meal, she would make it clear. She wouldn't ask for it directly. No, that was too simple. She would use guilt, as though my father should have known what she wanted without her having to say it. She would sigh, shake her head, and then make some offhand remark about how she could never have what she wanted. And my father, ever the giver, would immediately try to fix it. If she wanted a new dress, he would find a way to buy it, even if it meant going into debt. If she wanted something else, he would sacrifice whatever he had to make it happen. The worst part was that he never once questioned her motives. He believed that if he gave enough, he would finally earn her love, her approval. I remember once when I was around 16, witnessing a conversation between my parents that still haunts me. My mother had just asked for something, another new dress, one she'd seen in a magazine. My father, who had just finished a long shift at the garage, was tired, his face drawn from exhaustion. He sat at the kitchen table, his hand shaking slightly as he counted the money he had saved for bills. "I can't do it, Helen," he said, his voice low. "We don't have enough this month. We need to pay the bills, and I've barely got enough to cover everything." Helen, who had been sitting across from him, didn't respond immediately. She just stared at him with those cold, calculating eyes. After a few moments, she sighed, a sound so heavy with disappointment that it made my heart drop into my stomach. "Richard," she said softly, almost sweetly, "if you really love me, you would make it happen. You've always said that you would do anything for me, but I see now that you don't mean it. If you loved me, you'd find a way." Her words hit him like a slap. I could see the pain in his eyes, the guilt he felt. He had spent his entire life trying to prove his love for her, but it was never enough. And here she was, using the very thing he held most dear, his love for her, to get what she wanted. I watched him, helpless as he opened his wallet, pulled out the last of his savings, and handed it to her without another word. "Thank you," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. But I could see the glint of satisfaction in her eyes. She had won. She always did. I wanted to scream, to tell him that this wasn't love, that this wasn't what love was supposed to feel like. But I knew better. My father wasn't blind to her manipulation. He was just too deep in it to see a way out. And I knew that he would never stop. No matter how much she took from him, no matter how much he lost, he would always give more. That was the price he was willing to pay for love. But it wasn't just him who fell victim to her manipulation. It was me too. Over the years, I learned to play along, to do what was expected of me, to keep quiet, to stay out of her way. I learned how to keep my thoughts to myself, how to smile when she demanded something, how to keep my anger hidden. And I hated myself for it. I hated myself for letting her control me just like she controlled my father. One night, after my mother had left for her usual evening walk, I sat down in the living room with my father. It was late, and he was drinking his beer, his tired eyes staring blankly at the television. "Dad," I said softly, "do you see it? Do you see what she's doing to you?" He didn't answer at first, just took another long swig from his beer. But when he finally spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. "I don't have a choice, Sarah," he said, his words almost a whisper. "I love her. And when you love someone, you do whatever it takes to make them happy, even if it costs you everything." His words were the final blow, the final realization that nothing would ever change. This was my father's life now, caught in a web of manipulation that he could never escape. And it broke me to see it, to realize that the man I loved, the man who had always been so strong, had become a shell of himself, consumed by a love that wasn't really love at all, the burden of responsibility. As the months passed, I began to carry more weight than I ever thought I could bear. I had watched my father, once so strong, become a shadow of himself. But I hadn't fully understood the extent of the burden he carried until I found myself shouldering some of it. The responsibility for the house, for my mother, and even for my father's emotional well-being gradually fell to me. I was just a girl, but I had to grow up faster than I ever expected. It started slowly at first. My mother's indifference became more pronounced, and the housework that once fell to both of them gradually became mine. I didn't mind at first. I was used to doing a lot of the chores anyway. But soon it became clear that I was doing everything: cooking, cleaning, shopping, and trying to keep the house running while my father spent most of his time in the garage, working late into the night, trying to make up for the debts that had piled up from my mother's endless demands. I never complained, not to anyone. I knew that my father didn't have the strength to do it, and I couldn't bring myself to add to his load. But inside, I was growing more and more resentful. I was angry at my mother for demanding so much, for making my father feel as though he had to sacrifice everything just to keep her happy. But I was also angry at my father for letting it happen. He couldn't see that he was being used, that his love for my mother was slowly destroying him, and in doing so, it was also destroying me. The tipping point came one day when I came home from school to find my father sitting at the kitchen table, his head in his hands. He was exhausted, his face drawn and pale, as if the weight of the world was too much for him to carry. He had been working non-stop, trying to catch up on the bills, and yet the financial strain seemed to grow worse with each passing day. I could see that he was physically and emotionally drained, and it broke my heart to see him like this. I walked into the kitchen, my stomach tight with worry. "Dad, what's going on?" I asked gently, afraid of what I might hear. He looked up at me, his eyes red from lack of sleep and stress. I can't keep up, Sarah. No matter how hard I try, it's never enough. And your mother, she just wants more, more, more. I don't know how much longer I can do this. My heart sank as I listened to him. He was defeated. He had given everything he had, and yet he felt like it wasn't enough. And I knew, deep down, that no matter how much more he gave, it never would be enough. Not for her. It would never be enough for my mother. At that moment, something inside me snapped. I couldn't watch him do this to himself anymore. I couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine when I knew it wasn't. I had already been shouldering more than any child should have to. But now, it was time to face the truth. My father wasn't going to change unless something drastic happened. "Dad, you need to stop," I said, my voice trembling with the anger and frustration I had been holding inside for so long. "You can't keep doing this. You're killing yourself for someone who doesn't appreciate it. She doesn't care how hard you work, how much you sacrifice. It's never going to be enough for her." He flinched, as if my words were a slap to his face. "Don't say that, Sarah. You don't understand. I love her. I've always loved her." "I know you do," I said softly, my voice breaking. "But that's the problem. You love her so much that you're willing to destroy yourself for her. And it's not fair to you, Dad. It's not fair to either of us." He didn't answer, just sat there, looking defeated. And in that silence, I knew he was trapped in a cycle he didn't know how to break. His love for my mother had become an anchor, dragging him deeper and deeper into the abyss, and I wasn't sure how much longer I could hold on myself. Days passed, and I found myself taking on more and more of my father's responsibilities. I cooked every meal, cleaned every room, and tried to make sure everything was perfect, hoping that maybe, just maybe, my mother would notice and be proud of us. But she never did. The more I did, the more she expected. It was like trying to fill a well that had no bottom. No matter how much I gave, it was never enough. It wasn't just the household chores that weighed on me, it was the emotional burden too. I became my father's emotional caretaker, the one who listened when he cried, when he confessed his guilt, when he wondered aloud why my mother could never be satisfied. I tried to comfort him, to reassure him, but it wasn't enough. I could see that he was slipping away, that he was losing the will to keep fighting. And deep down, I knew that if I didn't do something, we would both drown in this toxic environment. One night, after dinner, I found myself sitting at the kitchen table, looking at my father as he drank his beer in silence, his eyes far away. I could see how much he was struggling, how much he was suffering, and it made me angry. Not at him, but at everything. At my mother for making him feel like he wasn't enough. At myself for not knowing how to fix it. I wanted to scream, to shake him, to make him see that he deserved better than this, that he deserved a life where he wasn't constantly sacrificing everything for a woman who didn't appreciate him. And then I realized something. I couldn't fix this. I couldn't fix my father's brokenness, and I couldn't fix my mother. The only person I had control over was myself. And for the first time, I made a decision that would change everything. I knew I had to leave. I had to break free from the suffocating weight of my parents' relationship and the responsibility that had been thrust upon me. If I didn't, I would lose myself too. That night, after my father went to bed, I packed a small bag. I didn't know where I was going yet, but I knew I couldn't stay there any longer. I couldn't keep living in the shadow of my parents' broken love, pretending everything was fine when I was drowning. I left a note for my father, telling him that I needed time to figure things out, that I needed to find my own path. It was the hardest decision I'd ever made, but it was also the most necessary. I knew that I had to break free, for my own sake. I couldn't keep living in that house, shouldering the weight of responsibility that wasn't mine to bear. And as I walked away from everything I had ever known, I knew that it was the first step toward healing. The first signs of secrets leaving home was harder than I had imagined. The weight of the decision sat heavily on my chest, and every step I took away from the house seemed to pull at my heart. My father's face haunted me, his tired eyes full of silent plea. He hadn't said much when I left, just stood at the doorway, watching me go. I didn't want to look back, because I was afraid I would change my mind. But even then, I couldn't escape the pull of the family I had left behind. I didn't know where I was going. I just needed to get out of Millfield, out of the suffocating atmosphere that had consumed our house for so long. I took the bus to Louisville, the closest city, with a few $100s I had saved over the years from odd jobs. It wasn't much, but it was all I had. I found a small apartment to rent, not far from a grocery store where I could get a job. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. For the first time in a long while, I felt a small sense of relief. But even as I tried to settle into this new life, the reality of what I had left behind began to catch up with me. I couldn't escape the memories of my mother, her cold eyes, and her demands that never seemed to end. I couldn't stop thinking about my father, the man who had given everything for a woman who had never given him a second thought. I couldn't stop wondering if he was okay, if he had noticed my absence, or if he even cared. One day, about 2 months after I left, I received a letter from my father. It was the first time he had written to me in years. I hadn't expected it. The letter was brief, just a few lines scrawled in his familiar handwriting. "Sarah, I hope you're doing okay. Your mother misses you. She's been worried. Please come home. It's been hard for me here without you. I don't know what to do anymore. Please think about it." Reading the letter felt like a punch to the gut. My heart broke for him. He was still under her control, still lost in the fog of her manipulation. He was reaching out, but it was clear he didn't understand that the problem wasn't just me leaving. It was the life they were living. I knew I couldn't go back. I couldn't return to that place, not when things were the way they were. A few weeks later, I received a second letter. This one was different. It wasn't from my father. It was from my mother. It arrived unannounced, a strange envelope with no return address. I tore it open without thinking, and as I read her words, a chill ran through me. "Sarah, I know you've been avoiding us, and I don't blame you, but I want you to know something. I'm sorry for how things went. Your father has been difficult, and I've had to make some hard decisions. I know he's not the man you think he is. There are things about him that you don't understand. I hope one day you'll realize that I've done what I had to do. I only wanted what was best for us." The words felt hollow. They didn't make sense. My mother's apology was an illusion, a carefully crafted message designed to make me feel guilty for leaving. She didn't care about my feelings, about how I had been affected by the years of manipulation and control. She cared only about herself, about her own image, about making sure I believed that everything she did was justified, and I saw through it. But then, at the end of the letter, there was something unexpected, something that sent a chill down my spine. "I hope you'll come home soon. There's something I need to tell you, something you don't know, something important. It concerns your father, and it concerns you." I stared at the letter for what felt like an eternity. What was she talking about? What was it that I didn't know? The words "important" and "something you don't know" echoed in my mind. I had to know what she was referring to. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to move on with my life, and leave the past behind. But another part of me, the part that still loved my father, that still wanted to protect him, couldn't shake the feeling that this was something I needed to understand. A few days later, I decided to go back to Millfield. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't want to give my mother the satisfaction of knowing that I had returned because of her letter. But I needed answers. I needed to know what she meant. I couldn't let it go. I arrived back in Millfield on a quiet afternoon, the streets empty, the air heavy with the weight of the past. My heart pounded as I walked up the familiar path to our house. I knew what I would find, but I didn't know if I was prepared for it. The door creaked open, and there they were, my father, sitting in his usual chair, his face tired and worn, his eyes searching mine as if he couldn't believe I was standing there. And then there was my mother, standing in the doorway, her arms crossed, a look of cold calculation on her face. She didn't smile, didn't welcome me. She simply stared at me, as if waiting for me to speak first. I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to scream at her, to demand the truth about whatever secret she was hiding, whatever it was that she thought I didn't know. But another part of me just wanted to escape, to leave again before the weight of the past crushed me. Finally, it was my father who broke the silence. His voice was shaky, almost apologetic. "Sarah," he said softly, "I'm glad you're here. Your mother has been worried. But there's something we need to talk about. It's about your mother's past, about things she's never told you." My breath caught in my throat. So it was true. My mother had secrets. Secrets she had been keeping from me, from my father, from everyone. And now it seemed she was finally going to reveal them. But why now? Why after all this time? Before I could respond, my mother stepped forward, her face hardening. "This isn't for you to know," she said, her voice icy. "Some things are better left in the past." But my father wasn't listening. He looked at me with the kind of sorrow that only years of regret can bring. "It's time, Sarah," he said quietly. "It's time for you to know the truth." The truth. It was a word that had been lost in our house for so long. And now, as I stood there, I couldn't help but wonder, what truth could possibly justify the years of manipulation, the years of suffering? What could she possibly say that would make any of it make sense? And just like that, the weight of the past, of everything I had lived through, came rushing back. The secrets, the lies, the manipulation, it was all about to come to light. But as I looked at my father, his eyes filled with regret and confusion, I knew one thing for sure. No matter what the truth was, it would never change what had already happened. It would never change the years of pain and brokenness that had shaped my life. A growing fear of her mother's power. The days that followed my return to Millfield felt like a blur. I wasn't sure what I expected to find when I walked back into that house, but the reality was much worse than I could have imagined. My mother's coldness, the way she controlled everything in that house, was more apparent than ever. And the truth she promised to reveal about herself and my father was like a dark cloud hanging over us, one I couldn't avoid no matter how hard I tried. I had been back for 3 days when she finally sat me down. Her cold eyes locked onto mine as though she were sizing me up, calculating the best way to break me. My father was sitting next to her, but it was clear that he was no longer the man I had once admired. He looked smaller, more fragile than I remembered, like a man who had given up on life. His once warm presence had been replaced by a hollow shell, and I hated seeing him like that. "Sarah," my mother began, her voice dripping with a sweetness that didn't match the look in her eyes. "There's something you need to know. Something about your father. Something you don't understand. My stomach churned. I had never liked the way my mother said things, the way she made it seem like everything was a secret. There was always something hidden, some part of the truth that she controlled, something she would withhold until it suited her to reveal it. I had learned early on that the less I knew about her, the better off I would be. But this time, it was different. I couldn't walk away from it. I needed to know the truth, no matter how much it hurt. "Go ahead," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Tell me." My father looked at me, his eyes full of regret. He didn't speak. He just sat there, his hands clenched tightly in his lap. It was as though he already knew what was coming and was too ashamed to speak up. My mother leaned forward, her smile never reaching her eyes. "You've always seen your father as a hero, haven't you?" she asked, her tone deceptively soft. "Well, let me tell you something about him that you don't know. Something that might change the way you see him forever." My heart began to race. The words I had feared were finally coming. But no matter how much I prepared myself, I wasn't ready for what came next. "When I first met your father," she continued, her voice smooth and calculated, "he was a different man. He was strong, confident, and had his own dreams. But then I came into his life, and everything changed." I felt a chill run down my spine. I didn't need to hear any more. I already knew the story she was telling, the one where she wove herself into the fabric of his life, and in doing so, twisted him into something less than what he had been. But I couldn't leave. I had to hear it all. "I took him away from everything he knew," she said, her gaze flicking briefly to my father. "He was mine, and I made sure he knew it. And over the years, I took everything from him, his confidence, his independence, his very spirit. I made him believe that he couldn't live without me." I wanted to scream, to shout at her that this wasn't the truth, that it couldn't be. But as I looked at my father, sitting there with his head bowed, I realized that what she was saying was the truth. She had broken him. She had taken everything he was and turned it into something that suited her needs. And he had let her. My mother continued, her voice cold and matter-of-fact. "You see, Sarah, your father isn't the man you think he is. He's weak. He always has been. And I've been the one holding everything together all these years. If it weren't for me, he would have fallen apart long ago." Each word she spoke felt like a knife digging deeper into the wound that had already been carved into my heart. She had made him small. She had taken his strength and made him dependent on her, and now she was admitting it without any shame. "I never loved him the way you think I did," she said, her eyes flicking to my father again. "I never needed him. He was just someone I could control. And the moment I realized how easy it was to control him, I knew I had to keep him in line. I knew that if I didn't, he would realize his own worth, and he would leave me." My chest tightened. I couldn't breathe. I had spent my entire life thinking that my parents' love was just flawed, that it was a love that had been misunderstood, but now I saw it for what it truly was. It wasn't love at all. It was manipulation. It was control. And it was destroying both of them. "You're lying," I managed to say, my voice shaking with emotion. "You're just trying to make him look like the bad guy. He was never like this before. You—" "Sarah," my mother interrupted, her voice hardening. "You have no idea what you're talking about. You were just a child, watching from the sidelines. You don't understand how things work between your father and me. I made him who he is. I kept him from falling apart. If it weren't for me, he would have been nothing." Her words hit me like a slap. The anger I had felt for her in the past, her coldness, her cruelty, was nothing compared to the anger I felt now. She was confessing everything, and yet she didn't see herself as the villain. She still believed that she was the one in control, that she had done nothing wrong. I turned to my father, my voice filled with disbelief. Is this true? Is this really how it happened? Is this what you've been living with all these years? He didn't answer. He just sat there, his eyes fixed on the floor. And in that silence I understood everything. He had given up his life to please her. He had sacrificed his happiness, his independence, and his self-worth, all for a woman who never loved him in the way he had loved her. And now she was admitting it, not out of guilt, but out of a twisted sense of pride. I stood up, my legs shaking beneath me. I can't believe this, I whispered, more to myself than to anyone else. I can't believe what you've done to him, to both of us. Without another word, I turned and walked out of the room, my mind racing, my heart breaking. My father had never been strong enough to stand up to her, and now I saw that he never would be. And I realized, with a sinking feeling, that if I stayed here any longer, I would become just like him, broken, submissive, and dependent on a woman who only took, never gave. The final test of love. The night I left the house, I did not look back. I couldn't. I had learned enough, seen enough to know that nothing in that place would ever change. My father was lost, and my mother, well, my mother had made sure of that. She had woven her control so tightly around him that there was no way out, not for him, and not for me either, unless I made the choice to leave. I thought that running away would give me peace, that it would free me from the suffocating grip of my family's dysfunction. But as I sat on the bus heading out of Millfield, I couldn't escape the thought that I had left my father behind, alone, in the midst of a relationship that had drained the life from him. What would happen to him without me? What would happen to him without someone to watch over him, someone to see the slow, subtle damage that my mother inflicted on him every single day? But what could I do? I was just one person, and I had my own life to live now. I had made the choice, and I had to stick with it. I didn't know how much time had passed before I heard the news, but when I did, it shattered everything I had tried to build since leaving Millfield. It was a call from a number I didn't recognize, but I picked it up, thinking it might be someone from work or an old friend from school. Instead, it was my father's voice on the other end, raspy and weak. "Sarah, I need to tell you something," he said, his voice trembling. "It's about your mother. Something happened. She's asking for you. She wants to see you." My heart began to race. "Dad, what's going on? What happened?" There was a long pause before he spoke again, as if he were struggling to find the words. "Sarah, she's dying," he whispered, the words barely audible. "She doesn't have long. The doctor said, it's cancer. She only has a few weeks left." I felt a coldness spread through me at his words. I had known that her cruelty had taken its toll on him, but hearing him say that she was dying, it felt like a slap to my face. How could she be so cold to him for all those years and now demand that he come to her side as she faced death? And what about me? What about the damage she had done to me? "I don't want to go back," I said, my voice trembling, my throat tight with emotion. "I don't want to see her. Not after everything. Not after what she did to you. To me." My father's voice broke through the silence, filled with desperation. "Please, Sarah. I need you to come. She's asking for you. She wants to make things right before it's too late. I don't know what else to do. I can't do this alone." I could hear the pain in his voice. the hopelessness that had never really left him, even after everything he had endured. And in that moment, something shifted inside me. I realized that I couldn't abandon him. Not now. Not when he was so broken. Not when he had given up everything to try and make my mother happy, and now she was taking him with her, piece by piece. "I'll come," I said softly. "I'll come back, for you, Dad. But I need to know. What does she want? What does she think she can say to make all this right?" "I don't know," my father replied, his voice thick with tears. "But she said she has something to tell you. Something you don't know. And maybe, just maybe, this will make it all make sense." I didn't know if I believed him. I didn't know if anything could make sense anymore. But I agreed to come. I couldn't let my father face this alone, even if it meant confronting everything I had tried to leave behind. The drive back to Millfield was the longest I had ever taken. The streets felt smaller, the air heavier, as if the town itself were holding its breath. I felt the weight of the years pressing down on me. All the anger, the frustration, the pain. It felt like the past was catching up with me, and I didn't know if I was ready to face it. When I arrived at the house, I found my father sitting at the kitchen table, his hands shaking as he looked at the floor. My mother's absence was palpable. The house, which had once felt like a home, now felt like a tomb, silent and empty, as though everything that had ever mattered was dying inside it. "Dad?" I said, my voice tentative as I walked into the kitchen. He looked up at me, his eyes red, his face tired. "She's upstairs," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "She's waiting for you." I took a deep breath, steeling myself for whatever was to come. I had already seen the damage my mother had done, but this felt different. This felt like the final confrontation, the last chance for her to justify everything, to explain away all the years of manipulation, of cruelty, of control. Could there be an explanation for what she had done? Could anything make it right? I climbed the stairs slowly, each step heavy with the weight of what I knew awaited me. At the door to her room, I paused for a moment. This was it. This was the moment I had feared for so long. When I opened the door, she was lying in the bed, her once beautiful face pale and gaunt, her green eyes barely open. She looked so fragile, so small, that for a brief moment I almost felt a pang of sympathy for her. But then I remembered everything she had done to my father, to me. And that sympathy quickly faded. She looked at me with those same cold eyes, but there was something different about the way she gazed at me now. It wasn't the calculating look I had come to know. It was something more vulnerable. For the first time in my life, I saw her as a person, as someone who had been broken by her own choices. "Sarah," she whispered, her voice weak. "I'm glad you came." I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I sat down beside her bed, feeling the weight of the years between us. "Mom," I said, my voice steady, though my heart was racing. "Why now? Why ask for me now? After everything you've done, why try to make it right now?" She took a shallow breath, her hands trembling as she reached for mine. "Because I've done terrible things, Sarah, and I'm sorry. I never wanted to hurt you. I never wanted to hurt him." I didn't know what to say. I didn't know if I believed her. But I knew this. Whatever she said now couldn't erase the years of manipulation, of control. It couldn't change the truth. "I'm sorry too," I said softly. "But you can't take back what's been done. You can't undo the hurt." Her eyes filled with tears as she looked at me, and for a fleeting moment, I saw a woman who had been lost long ago, a woman who had never known how to love in a healthy way, and in that moment, I realized something. She wasn't asking for forgiveness. She was asking for release. "I just wanted you to understand," she whispered, "that I did it all for love." And with those words, she closed her eyes for the last time, leaving me with a truth I would carry with me forever. That love, when twisted by manipulation and control, isn't love at all. The aftermath of truth. The days following my mother's death were a blur, a haze of emotion and confusion. I hadn't expected her to pass so quickly, but once she was gone, there was a strange sense of finality in the air. The house felt emptier, quieter, as if the space she had occupied for so many years had become a vacuum, pulling everything into itself. My father, who had always been so distant and withdrawn, seemed even more fragile in the wake of her passing. It was as though her death had not brought him peace, but instead had left him with an even deeper emptiness. I stayed in Millfield for the funeral, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I didn't belong there anymore. The life I had left behind, the life that had been shaped by my mother's manipulation, seemed like a distant memory, one that I was trying to forget. I had made the decision to leave once, and now, as I sat in the kitchen, trying to make sense of everything that had happened, I realized that I needed to leave again. I needed to break free from the past, from everything my mother had built, and carve out a new path for myself. But even as I thought about leaving, I knew it wouldn't be so simple. There were still things left unsaid, questions that I had to ask, truths I had to face. And the person I needed to confront wasn't my mother. It was my father. He hadn't spoken much since the funeral. He spent most of his time sitting in the living room, staring at the walls, lost in thought. When I did speak to him, his responses were short and absent, as though he were still living in a fog. I could see that he was struggling, that he didn't know how to process the years of emotional damage that had been done to him. But I also knew that he had never been good at expressing his feelings. He had never been one to ask for help, never one to confront his demons. It was late in the evening when I decided to speak to him. The house was quiet, the only sound the creaking of the old floorboards beneath my feet. I found him sitting in his chair, his hands folded in his lap, his eyes distant. He looked so small, so lost, that my heart ached for him. But I knew that I couldn't leave without having the conversation we needed to have. "Dad?" I said softly, approaching him cautiously. "Can we talk?" He looked up at me, his eyes heavy with sadness. He didn't say anything at first, just nodded, as if he were waiting for me to speak. I took a deep breath and sat down beside him, my hands trembling slightly as I tried to find the words. "I know this isn't easy," I began, my voice soft but steady. "But I need to understand, Dad. I need to know why you let her do this to you. Why you let her control you for all these years." He flinched at my words but didn't look away. Instead, he seemed to shrink further into himself, as if my question had triggered something deep within him that he wasn't ready to confront. But I couldn't stop. I couldn't let him stay lost in the fog any longer. "Dad, I need to know what happened," I continued, my voice breaking slightly. "I need to know why you never stood up to her, why you never fought back. You're not weak, and I know you're not stupid. So why did you let her do this to you? To both of us?" For a long time, he didn't say anything. The silence stretched between us, heavy and suffocating. I could see the struggle on his face, the battle between the man he had once been and the broken shell of himself that my mother had left behind. But finally, after what felt like an eternity, he spoke. "I didn't know how," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. I thought if I gave her everything, if I just loved her enough, she would love me back. I thought that's what love was. But I was wrong. His words hit me like a slap. I had known, on some level, that my father had been trapped in the cycle of my mother's manipulation. But hearing him admit it, hearing him acknowledge that he had been blinded by his love for her, was a revelation I wasn't prepared for. I didn't know how to be anything but what she wanted me to be, he continued, his voice trembling now. I didn't know how to break free from it. Every time I tried, it felt like I was losing her, and I couldn't bear the thought of that. I loved her so much, Sarah. I thought that was all that mattered. I could hear the regret in his voice, the pain of realizing too late that his love had been misdirected. He had spent so many years trying to prove his worth to her, trying to show her that he loved her, that he had lost sight of who he was. And in the process, he had let her take everything. His self-respect, his happiness, his very identity. But you didn't deserve that, I said softly, my heart breaking for him. You didn't deserve to be treated like that. You didn't deserve to lose yourself in her. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked at me, his eyes full of regret and shame. I know, he whispered. I know I didn't. But it's too late now. She's gone, and I don't know how to live with what's left. I could see the weight of his words in his eyes, the sense of hopelessness that had taken root in him over the years. My mother had been the center of his world, and now that she was gone, he didn't know how to exist without her. He was lost, and no matter how much I wanted to help him, I knew that I couldn't fix what had been broken. Not by me, not by anyone. I'm sorry, he said, his voice barely audible. I'm sorry for everything. I'm sorry I let her hurt you too. I didn't know how to respond. I didn't know how to tell him that it wasn't his fault, that he had done the best he could with what he had. But I also knew that I couldn't let him continue to blame himself. He had been a victim, just like I had. We had both been caught in the same web of manipulation, and now it was time to heal, time to break free. I'm not angry with you, Dad, I said quietly. I'm angry at what happened, at what she did to both of us. But I'm not angry with you, and you don't have to carry this burden alone. I'm here. I'll always be here. He looked at me then, his eyes filled with something I hadn't seen in years, a flicker of hope. And in that moment, I realized something. No matter how broken we were, we could still heal. We could still move forward. The past couldn't be undone, but we didn't have to let it define us. I don't know what to do next, he said, his voice uncertain. I don't know how to live without her. We'll figure it out together, I replied softly. We'll take it one day at a time. And we'll start by letting go of the past. In that moment, I knew that the journey wasn't over. It was just beginning. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but for the first time in years, I felt like we might actually have a chance at healing. Together. A new path forward. The days following my conversation with my father were different. There was no grand revelation or sudden transformation, no magic cure for the years of pain we had both endured. But there was a subtle shift, a quiet understanding that perhaps the hardest part was behind us. We weren't fixed, and we may never be whole again, but we had taken the first step toward healing. It wasn't much, but it was something. I moved back into the house for a time, not to stay permanently, but to help my father get back on his feet. There was something symbolic about returning, about reclaiming that space that had been so toxic for so long. The house had been a battlefield, a place where my mother's manipulations had torn us apart. Now, in the wake of her passing, it felt like the beginning of something new. Something I couldn't quite define but knew we needed to try. The first few nights were the hardest. The silence in the house was deafening. The things we hadn't said, The years of unspoken grief hung in the air like a weight that we couldn't shake off. My father didn't sleep much, and I found myself lying awake too, thinking about everything that had happened. There was so much left unsaid, so many things we would never get the chance to fix. But we tried. In the mornings, I would cook breakfast, nothing fancy, just eggs and toast. But it felt like a small victory, a small step toward normalcy. My father, though quiet and withdrawn, would sit at the table, slowly sipping his coffee, his eyes watching me as I moved around the kitchen. It was a routine, simple and unremarkable, but it was ours. It was something we could both hold on to. As the days passed, I began to notice subtle changes in him. He started walking around the house a little more, spent less time in the garage, and began to take an interest in things again. At first, it was small things, checking the mail, picking up the yard, watering the plants. But as he found his footing, he began to rediscover parts of himself that had been buried for years. His hands, which had once been stained with grease from working at the auto shop, were now busy fixing things around the house, taking pride in simple tasks. For the first time in a long time, I saw him smile, even if it was just for a brief moment. We didn't talk much about my mother anymore. It wasn't that we were avoiding it. It was just that the conversation felt too heavy, too painful to revisit. Instead, we focused on the present, the things we could control. And in those moments, I saw my father in a new light. He wasn't the broken man I had once thought him to be. He was still lost in many ways, still struggling with the weight of the past, but he was slowly finding his way back. I, too, found myself changing. I had spent so many years running away from my family, from the dysfunction that had defined my childhood. I had tried to build a life for myself, far away from Millfield, but I realized that no matter how far I went, the past would always be there. It was a part of me, a part of who I was, and as much as I wanted to escape it, I had to face it head on. So I stayed. I stayed because I knew that in order to move forward, I needed to come to terms with everything that had happened. The more time I spent with my father, the more I realized how much he had been a victim of circumstances, of a toxic relationship that had consumed him. He had been manipulated by my mother, yes, but he had also allowed it to happen. He had allowed himself to believe that he couldn't live without her, that he wasn't worthy of anything else. And in that belief, he had lost himself. But now he was beginning to find his way back, piece by piece. And it wasn't just him. This was my chance to find my way back too. To reclaim who I was, separate from the influence of my mother, to find my own voice. It wasn't easy. Every day was a struggle. The old patterns, the old habits, the old wounds didn't just disappear overnight. But slowly, we both began to heal. We learned to talk to each other without fear, without the weight of years of resentment and guilt. We learned to listen, not just to each other, but to ourselves. We learned to forgive, not just my mother, but ourselves, for allowing her to dictate the course of our lives for so long. One afternoon, about a month after my mother's death, I was sitting on the porch, watching the sun set over the fields, when my father came outside. He had a worn, leather-bound book in his hands, something I had never seen before. He sat down next to me, his face serious but calm, and handed it to me. "What's this?" I asked, turning the book over in my hands. "It's a journal," he said quietly. "A record of things. Things I should have said a long time ago." I opened the journal and began to read. At first it was just a collection of thoughts, memories, fragments of my father's life. He wrote about his childhood, his dreams before he met my mother, the way he had always wanted to be more than just a mechanic, how he had hoped for something different, something better. As I read, I felt a pang of guilt. I had never known these things about him, how much he had sacrificed for my mother, how much he had given up in order to make her happy. He had never shared any of this with me before. It was as if he had hidden it all away, buried it deep inside. But as I continued reading, I saw something else. I saw my father's realization, his awakening. He wrote about how, after my mother's death, he had come to understand that his life didn't have to be defined by her, that he could still find happiness, still find meaning, even in the aftermath of everything he had lost. It was a raw, vulnerable account of a man who had spent too long hiding from his own emotions, from his own pain, and who was now ready to confront it, head on. He looked at me as I closed the journal, his eyes filled with something that resembled hope. "I've spent my whole life running from things, Sarah. Running from myself, running from what I've lost. But I'm not going to do that anymore." I smiled at him, a small, knowing smile. "You don't have to. You're not alone anymore." For the first time in a long time, my father seemed at peace. He wasn't whole, none of us were, but he was starting to rebuild. And for me, that was enough. I knew we still had a long way to go, but we were no longer defined by the darkness of the past. We had a chance to start over, together. The strength of healing. It had been 6 months since my mother's death, and the changes in both my father and me were undeniable. The house still felt haunted by her absence, but in many ways, it felt freer, lighter. It wasn't that the pain had disappeared. No, that would never be the case. But we had learned to navigate it, to acknowledge it without letting it control us. We were rebuilding, slowly but surely, like two people finding their way back to themselves after years of being lost. My father had begun to return to his routine, but it wasn't the same. There was a quiet confidence in him now that hadn't been there before. I saw it in the way he carried himself, in the way he made decisions without hesitation, in the way he started repairing the things around the house that had been left undone for too long. It was as though he had finally come to terms with the fact that his life didn't have to revolve around my mother's demands, that he could live on his own terms. For the first time, in a long time, I saw the man I had always known him to be, the man who had been buried beneath years of emotional manipulation. As for me, I had begun to reclaim my life in ways I hadn't even realized I had lost it. I started taking better care of myself, physically, emotionally, and mentally. I signed up for a class at the local community college, something I had always wanted to do, but had never had the courage to try. I made new friends, formed connections with people who didn't know about my past, people who accepted me for who I was now, not who I had been. It was liberating, to say the least, to start over, to feel like I was building something fresh and untainted by the years of dysfunction I had lived through. But even as I started to heal, I realized that I wasn't fully free of the past. There were still remnants of the old patterns in me, those moments of self-doubt, those moments of hesitation when I thought I wasn't enough. I had grown up in an environment where love was conditional, where affection was a currency that had to be earned. And even now, I found myself questioning whether I was worthy of the love I had worked so hard to build around me. One afternoon, after class, I sat on the porch of our house, watching the sunlight fade over the horizon. It was peaceful, the quiet of the evening settling around me. But as I sat there, I felt that old fear creeping up on me again. The fear that I was just pretending to be okay, that somehow, beneath the surface, I was still the same broken person I had been before. I felt the weight of the past pressing down on me, trying to pull me back into the darkness. But then, something changed. I heard footsteps behind me, and I turned to see my father standing in the doorway. He had a smile on his face, a small, warm smile that reached his eyes. It was the first time I had seen him smile like that in a long time, and it made my heart swell with something I couldn't quite put into words. "Mind if I sit?" he asked, his voice soft, tentative. I shook my head and patted the space beside me. "Of course not, Dad." He sat down next to me, and for a long time, neither of us spoke. We just sat there, watching the colors of the sunset change in the sky. It was as if, in that moment, everything else could fall away. The pain, the regret, the fear. It was just us, together, in a moment of quiet peace. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I didn't have to carry the weight of the world on my shoulders. Finally, my father broke the silence. "Sarah," he began, his voice thoughtful, almost hesitant. "I know we've been through a lot, and I know I wasn't the father you needed me to be. I wasn't there for you when you needed me most." I turned to look at him, surprised by his words. "Dad, we've talked about this. I'm not angry with you. You don't have to keep apologizing." He gave a small shake of his head, his eyes focused on the horizon. "I know, but I need to say it. I've spent so many years thinking I had to fix things for you, that I had to protect you from all the pain in our lives. But the truth is, I couldn't protect you from everything. And I should have let you see it all, the good and the bad. I should have let you see me for who I was, and not tried to shield you from everything." I felt a lump form in my throat, and I had to swallow hard to keep from crying. "Dad, you did the best you could. You were doing what you thought was right. I don't blame you for anything." He nodded, but I could see that the weight of his words was still heavy on him. He had spent so much of his life trying to fix things, trying to make them right, and yet it felt like nothing had ever worked. I knew it wasn't just about my mother anymore. It was about all the mistakes he had made, all the things he wished he had done differently. "We're still here," I said softly, trying to reassure him. "We're still alive. And we've both come so far. You've come so far." "I'm trying," he replied, his voice filled with a mix of sadness and determination. "But I need you to understand something, Sarah. I've spent my life making mistakes, and I know I can't go back and change them. But I want you to know that I'm here now. I'm not the same man I was. I want to be better. For you. For me." For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of the wind rustling through the trees, the soft hum of the world around us. I thought about everything we had been through, everything we had lost, and everything we had gained. It wasn't perfect. It would never be perfect. But it was ours, and it was real. "I know, Dad," I said, my voice steady. "And I'm here too. We'll figure this out, one step at a time." He smiled again, this time more freely. "I'm proud of you, Sarah. I always have been." The words hung in the air between us, simple but meaningful. It was the first time my father had said that to me in years, and it made something inside me shift. For so long, I had been waiting for his approval, waiting for him to see me, to notice me. But now I realized that I didn't need that approval anymore. I didn't need him to validate me. I was finally starting to see myself, to recognize my own worth. We sat there for a long time, watching the sky darken, not saying much, but knowing that we were finally starting to heal. We had a long way to go, but for the first time, I felt like the weight of the past was starting to lift. It wasn't about forgetting what had happened. It was about learning how to live with it, how to move forward despite it. And in that quiet moment, I knew that we were ready. We were ready to begin again. Rebuilding what was lost. It was strange, in the weeks that followed, to see my father begin to reclaim his life in the way that he did. The man who had been so consumed by guilt and fear, who had given up so much for the sake of someone who never truly appreciated him, was slowly rediscovering his independence. It wasn't a dramatic transformation, but it was real. Every little decision he made, every step he took toward regaining control, was a victory. I watched him with a quiet pride, amazed at the quiet strength that had always been buried beneath years of insecurity and self-doubt. I had been living with him for a few months now, and every day seemed like a small milestone. His routine had shifted, subtly but unmistakably. He spent his mornings outside, tending to the garden my mother had always neglected. He would fix things around the house, small repairs, the kind of tasks that he had put off for years because he had been too busy trying to please her, too busy losing himself in her needs. But now, he worked with a calm, purposeful energy, as if he were slowly piecing himself back together, bit by bit. I, too, found myself becoming more confident in my own choices. When I first left Millfield, I had been running from my past, from the pain, from the toxic environment that had shaped me. But the longer I stayed, the more I realized that running wasn't the answer. I had to confront the past, face it head on, and rebuild from the ground up. And it wasn't just about my relationship with my father. It was about me finding my own voice, about rediscovering who I was and what I wanted from life, independent of the patterns that had defined me for so long. One day, as I was walking through the yard, I saw my father standing by the old oak tree that had been there as long as I could remember. His back was to me, and he seemed deep in thought. It was one of those rare, quiet moments when the world seemed to stand still. I approached him cautiously, not wanting to disturb the peace of the moment. "Dad?" I said softly. He turned around, his face lighting up with a smile. There was something different about him now, a softness, a peace that hadn't been there before. "Hey, Sarah, didn't hear you coming." I smiled back, feeling the bond between us strengthening in ways I hadn't expected. "What's on your mind?" He leaned against the tree, his arms crossed over his chest. "Just thinking about how much time I wasted, Sarah. Thinking about the years I spent trying to make things right with your mother when all I had to do was make things right with myself." His words hit me harder than I expected. For so long I had blamed him for everything. The way he had allowed my mother to manipulate him, the way he had neglected me and lost himself in her demands. But now, as I listened to him speak, I realized that he had been just as much a victim as I had been. He had been so consumed by the need to be loved, to feel worthy, that he had lost sight of the one thing that really mattered: himself. "I get it now," he continued, his voice quiet but firm. "I thought if I just gave more, worked harder, she would love me more. I thought that if I just kept sacrificing, everything would be okay. But I was wrong. Love doesn't work like that. It shouldn't be about giving until there's nothing left. Love should lift you up, not drag you down." I felt a lump form in my throat as I listened to him. His voice had always been strong, but now it was filled with something deeper. Regret, yes, but also a kind of understanding. He was finally seeing the truth, and so was I. "We can't change the past," I said softly, stepping closer to him. "But we can move forward. We can choose to let go of what doesn't serve us, and we can choose to rebuild." He looked at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and sadness. "You're right, Sarah. We can't change what happened, but we can make the most of what we have left." The quiet truth of his words settled between us, a recognition that we couldn't change the past, but that we had the power to shape the future. We had both been victims of the same destructive cycle, but we were no longer trapped by it. We were free to move forward, to live without the shadow of my mother's control hanging over us. Over the next few weeks, things between us continued to evolve. We worked together to repair the house, to fix what had been broken, physically and emotionally. It wasn't always easy. There were days when the past came rushing back, when I would find myself remembering the things we had endured, the years of suffering, the manipulation. There were days when I would look at my father and feel the weight of all that had happened, and I would wonder if we would ever truly be able to heal. But then, I would see my father laughing at something silly, something small, and I would realize that we were healing, slowly, steadily, one step at a time. One afternoon, as we sat down for lunch, my father turned to me, his face thoughtful. "Sarah, I've been thinking," he said, his voice still carrying that hint of uncertainty, "about us, about what comes next." I raised an eyebrow, curious. "What do you mean?" He set his sandwich down and looked at me earnestly. "I want to make things right with you. I want to be the father you deserve. I've spent so long living in the shadows of the past that I forgot what it means to be present. I want to change that. I want to be here for you, in the way I should have been all along." I felt a wave of emotion rise within me. This was it. This was the moment I had been waiting for him to truly see me, for him to acknowledge the hurt, the damage that had been done. And now, he was offering me something I had longed for without realizing it. A chance to truly rebuild our relationship, to start again from a place of mutual respect and understanding. "I'm not going anywhere, Dad," I said, my voice steady, my heart full. "We've both been through so much, but I'm here now, and I'm not going to leave you again." He smiled, his face softening with relief. "Thank you, Sarah. I know I haven't been perfect, but I'm going to try. For you." And in that moment, something inside me shifted. I had spent so much of my life running from the pain, from the past, from the toxic cycle of manipulation. But now, I realized, I didn't have to run anymore. I didn't have to carry the weight of my past alone. We were both here, together, facing the future, one step at a time. The road ahead wasn't clear, and I knew there would still be bumps along the way. But for the first time in my life, I felt hopeful. I felt like we could do this. We could rebuild what was lost and make something new. And that was enough. The strength of new beginnings. The journey I had taken, both alone and with my father, had been one of tremendous growth. When I first left Millfield, I believed that escaping would give me the freedom I had craved for so long. But in the process of rebuilding my life, I discovered something much more profound. Freedom doesn't come from running away. It comes from facing the things we fear, from confronting the painful truths we've buried deep inside, and from choosing to build something new out of the ashes of our past. In many ways, the hardest part of this journey had been learning how to forgive. Not just my mother, but myself. For years, I had carried the burden of guilt and resentment, blaming myself for the dysfunction in our family, for the things I couldn't change. But as time passed, I came to understand that forgiveness wasn't about excusing the pain or erasing the past. It was about letting go of the hold that pain had on me, about making peace with the fact that we all have flaws and we all make mistakes. It wasn't easy. There were days when I would still find myself haunted by memories of my mother's manipulations, her cruelty, the way she had turned my father into someone unrecognizable. But with each passing day, the weight of those memories grew lighter. I no longer felt like I was defined by my past. I could remember it, acknowledge it, but it didn't control me anymore. And in that freedom, I found something I had never known before: peace. My father had come a long way too. The man I saw now wasn't the same person who had let himself be consumed by my mother's demands. He had started to reclaim his life, step by step, as though he were rediscovering the man he had once been before all of the emotional turmoil. It was incredible to watch, and I found myself grateful for the small moments that now felt like victories. Him fixing things around the house without hesitation, him getting involved in community activities, him smiling genuinely instead of with the empty, hollow smile he once wore. And then, one day, as we were sitting together on the porch, my father turned to me with a look that I hadn't seen before: complete sincerity. "Sarah," he said, his voice quiet but strong, "I've spent a lot of years thinking I could only find happiness by making up for the past. But I think I was wrong. I spent too much time trying to fix things that were already broken. What I needed to do was focus on what's ahead. I think that's what I've finally started to understand." I looked at him, feeling a lump form in my throat. For so long, I had watched him struggle, watched him get lost in his own guilt, never fully able to let go of the things my mother had done to him. To hear him speak like this was a revelation, a sign that he was finally free. "You've learned a lot, Dad," I said softly, my voice thick with emotion. "And so have I. We've both been through so much, but I think we're stronger for it. We're not defined by our past anymore. We're free to choose what comes next." He smiled, a slow, heartfelt smile. "I'm proud of you, Sarah. I don't know what I would have done without you." His words hit me harder than I expected, and for the first time in years, I felt the bond between us become solid again. We weren't perfect, and there was still a lot of healing left to do, but we had come a long way, and more importantly, we had come through it together. That afternoon, as we sat there, the sky painted in hues of pink and gold, I realized that this was the moment I had been waiting for. Not the moment when everything was perfect, because I knew that would never happen, but the moment when I truly understood what healing meant. It meant allowing ourselves to feel the pain, to sit with it, and then to move forward. It meant acknowledging the past without letting it dictate who we were or who we could become. It meant making the conscious choice to move forward, even when the path wasn't clear. As time passed, life began to settle into a new rhythm. My father and I continued to work on the house, fixing things that had been neglected for so long. He started attending support groups for men who had been in abusive relationships, and I found myself growing closer to the community in ways I had never expected. I continued my classes, and I even began considering what my future might look like beyond Millfield. I had never been one to think much about my future. I had always been too focused on surviving the present. But now, for the first time, I allowed myself to dream again. And that in itself was a victory. One evening, a few months later, I sat in the living room, reading a book when my father came in, holding something in his hands. It was a small, framed picture, one I hadn't seen in years. It was a photo of us before everything had fallen apart. I was just a child in the picture, standing next to my father, his arm around me, both of us smiling into the camera. "I found this today," he said softly, holding the picture out to me. I thought it was lost. I took the frame from him, my fingers brushing against the glass. It was a simple picture, taken on one of those rare days when everything felt right. I remembered that day, how happy we had been, how whole we had felt. It felt like a lifetime ago. "I don't know what to do with all this," he said quietly. "I don't know how to make up for the years I lost. but I think I've finally figured out that I don't have to. What matters is the here and now." I nodded, looking at the picture. "It's not about the past anymore, Dad. It's about who we are now, who we choose to be." He smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes. "Then I'm going to keep moving forward. And so are you." The peace between us, the understanding, felt like something new, something that had been built slowly, brick by brick, until we had created something stronger than what had been there before. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. As the years passed, my father and I continued on our journey of healing. We didn't forget the past, but we didn't let it control us either. We chose to live fully, to embrace the present, and to build a future that was rooted in understanding, love, and forgiveness. We learned that healing wasn't a destination. It was a process. And it was a process we would walk together every step of the way. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew this: whatever came next, we were ready for it. We had found our strength in the face of our greatest struggles, and that strength would carry us through whatever challenges lay ahead. The key lesson in this story is the power of healing and the importance of choosing to move forward, even when the past is painful. Life often throws challenges our way, whether through loss, betrayal, or emotional scars, and it can feel overwhelming to confront them. But the true strength lies in how we choose to face our past and build our future. Healing doesn't mean forgetting or erasing what happened, but learning to live alongside it, using it as a source of growth rather than a weight that holds us down. It's about accepting that we are not defined by the mistakes or the pain others have caused us, but by our ability to choose love, forgiveness, and resilience. No matter how old we are, it's never too late to reclaim our peace, to reconnect with our loved ones, or to make new beginnings. The lesson is clear. We have the power to reshape our lives at any age, to heal, and to find joy once again, one step at a time. It's about making the decision to be free and to embrace the life we still have ahead of us. Thank you for sharing this story with me today. I hope it touched a part of your heart, just as it did mine. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Where are you watching from today? And if you felt moved by this story, be sure to check out the next video in this series, where we dive deeper into stories of strength and transformation. Until then, remember, there is always hope, no matter where life's journey takes us.